kalwa sia solai maklubok le ngitu tau mer other belau rogui katangal tangat le president of republic Johnson Toribiong au bangeder al tu tau el mo ochuyak maru mo introduce ra kestergid el clela Jeffrey L. Farrow nganga adra Merikel el tilobo de sel velura US Virgin Island men sag dingul mor sei gide solai ngwa Michael ngum sub president mong mo o ay sirgid luasen kal Jeff Farrow ngaram lar mul mergid ngaran dir kamrul Michael betok teleng tengil sel compactu el altame kul nitra president mbol ngwa Mike sola sodin mergid. Mr. President.
Aragote malungi tu tahun mergemi rogui loring setial program baru mesing da television eme kote al ebudersi ya susrangan morai betul mar play mar bul belau mar senators mar delegates mar governors mar declare belau rogui spiritual television mar radio bengel ngal lingia consultant advisor compact review team sodi adru lela compact review agreement langaram dari US Congress. Kalau penggega Jeffrey L. Farrow nga adra US Virgin Islands langara Caribbean. Nga giblem haringi lo penggela Ambassador Koshibara 2009 el monte erigit langaram Rigel. Yo lo penggela Congress ma office representative Rigel igidel tal compact review agreement langaran ni sai sila September 3 2010. Jeffrey Farrow el altime en Washington DC lo nasceu a government Ragal Brura Miguel ma US Congress ma executive branch nga amle ko tumoro ra White House e mula Jimmy Carter ra 1979 mo 1981 sel time ya madalela amalut gira gil yun sel Miguel lumara lo banggela trust territory ma balur belau direct laring aklaw dangiringi ma imal almor omsode la compact travelur belau Auriura 81 rabol mage Jimmy Carter emnora US Congress emlo senior staff ra 1982 almora 1994 almara gel committee ra Congress ra House of Representatives lo ngara ala gel yun sra Miguel ma US trust territory babalur belau direct ngadal gil mok mora compact belau el modo lir silnges el mor hospital rablur belau ya uri say em lo bengela president Bill Clinton ra White House ra 1994 el mora 2001 el nar sil gingal lo ngara ala gel yuns el ngare ugelam rigel lo dimokringi ablur belau esera 2008 el bringa senkira ablur rigel engle tokubets el advisor malubeng manager Hillary Clinton Raigel Yuns el ngale ungalam Rigel luli mukringa Puerto Rico radal kiringi aguk peto radal ke 22 states rabluram Rigel sera 209 makporam Rigel rablu rakmu obis rangara March sel time ya Minister of State Sandra Pirantosi amle golringi magim lo Swiss yau era bau untuk Hillary Clinton agimlo kau dengai emlo samaria ra background dengai maklau dengai gira la Calvin Trump ligir eumela Democratic President Hillary Clinton magim le haringi mo advisor ra compact review ra belur belau eli en gulban tirgel tewal staff ra US Congress ra House ma Senate Republicans ma Democrats le brief ra leadership belau Arup gule belam narsei ibadul maraklay rather all bilam narsei ra Senate ma House mar governors sa coastal states mar cabinet terngak tial meeting an laringir etiu klogol mok medal swelb iltirgel staff ra Congress America lamlay naringi Al Stayman naringi Brian Modest naringi Bonnie Bruce naringi Isaac Edwards tirgang ti egel kami tira House ma Senate al sa tra compact el alto tau engogiwa ontirar to club yakliu telmertial program nga kama Mr. Farrow Jeff el mutul mosmodi adru lel a compact review agreement lang randala Congress tiya ko to club el kultel bil tiya gidia waloya raudo del mirablur belau mangesura Miguel makmot al at this time I would like to now turn the floor over to our moderator Senator Alfonso Diaz to pick it up from there and have Jeff answer all questions you may have and summarize the situation in the U.S. Congress on the approval process for the Compact Review Agreement, which we signed with his assistance in Honolulu on September 3, 2010. Thank you, Senator.
Okay. Good morning to you, Jeff. Good morning, Mr. President. Yeah. First of all, I would like to take this opportunity on behalf of the people of Palau and the leadership of Palau. We thank you. We thank you so much, for take such a long trip to come and visit us and then brief us of what's going on. To include the senior staff of the United States Congress, that they only had one day here on the island, and I looked at them yesterday. They were very tired and sleepy, but they were able to deliver such a good message in regards to Compact 2 agreement. But you stayed behind after they left last night, and you mentioned to me and also President that you want to come out in public and brief us. Not yesterday you briefed the leadership of this country, but the average citizen of this country that do have a right to know what's going on with our compact deserve the right to hear what you have to say. So if you don't mind, I'll give you a microphone so you can talk all you want to brief us to the detail, and then after that, we have 1 hour and 30 minutes. And we turn the mic over to the public and let them ask questions. So the public, here's what I'm asking you to do. Make sure that you only ask anything about Compact 2 agreement. No campaign questions, no other questions besides questions pertaining to Compact agreement. Okay? So at this time, I've got the microphone is on you, and you may start, Mr. Farrell.
Thank you, Senator Diaz, and it's a pleasure and honor to be with you. It's a pleasure to be with you in part because of your service to the United States when you were in the U.S. military, and I admire what you've done in building OTV and the radio station, MBTV, to inform the people, to provide a way of informing the people of Palau about current affairs. Since I've been here, which is very brief, as you mentioned, I've seen your program and some of the call-in questions, and I look forward to answering questions that people have. As you said, the people certainly have a right to know everything about the relationship between the United States and Palau and how it is being addressed for the future. This is a subject that's very near and dear to my heart because I've spent so much time working on it. As the president introduced me, and he mentioned that I worked in the Carter White House, and I don't understand Palauan, so I'm not exactly sure everything he said. I hope what he said was good. But when I was in the Carter White House, one of my assignments was to be responsible for overseeing the negotiation of the Compact of Free Association Agreement. And then, as the President mentioned, I went to Capitol Hill, the Congress of the United States, and I was the lead staff member responsible for the Compact legislation, including the improvements that we made to the Compact in the Congress, encouraged by people like then President of the Senate Joshua Koshiba, that there were certain things that the United States should do before the trusteeship had terminated that had not been done by that time. Palau needed a new, good hospital, and Palau had problems with corruption in government, with drug trafficking, and so we had a very difficult time in the Congress and with the executive branch of the United States at that time of making some improvements to the compact. We didn't correct everything that I felt we needed to correct at that time, but we got a good agreement, and it was finally approved by the people of Palau, and that was not surprising because I recognize the close affinity between Palau and the United States and the affection that the people of Palau feel for the United States after the 50 years of trusteeship, after the liberation of Palau during World War II. and the United States' efforts to help Palau develop socially and economically as well as politically into becoming a sovereign nation in free association with the United States. I was also privileged to be back in the White House a second time under President Clinton, as President Teribiong mentioned, when the compact was implemented between the United States and Palau in 1994. The compact, I think it's may be helpful to some people who are younger than I am, and to understand what some fundamentals about the compact and about free association between the United States and Palau. The compact, and I won't get too detailed, but the compact provides the United States with military rights, strategic rights, as you know, and specifically some rights to specific lands for military purposes if needed by the United States for a 50-year period. And the compact also specified the assistance that the United States would provide Palau for its development and the needs of its people, programs of its government, for a 15-year period. And the compact then said that there would be a review of free association at the 15-year, 30-year, and 40-year anniversaries of that 50-year period of U.S. military rights. The compact was implemented, as I mentioned, in 1994, which meant that 2009 was the 15-year anniversary of the compact and required a review of the compact and whether the United States and Palau wanted to continue to be freely associated and what assistance the United States would provide to Palau for the next 15-year period. The compact also included a trust fund, as I'm sure most people know. And when the compact was originally being considered in the Congress, it was clear to me that the money that the U.S. deposited into the trust fund, a total of $70 million over in 2 deposits, was not going to be adequate for the purpose of the trust fund. And the purpose of the trust fund was to ensure that Palau, through the trust fund, after year 15 of the compact, would receive in earnings from the trust fund $15 million a year from year 16 of free association through year 50. But we felt at the time that we were making the improvements and passing the compact legislation that this was a matter that we could address at the 15th anniversary. We would see how the trust fund performed. We would see how Palau developed economically. We would be able to see what Palau's specific needs were for assistance from year 16 to year 30. And this made a lot of sense. It's hard for any of us to think what our needs will be and our budget should be for the next year or for the next 2 years, and certainly thinking about what assistance Palau might need 16 years into the future was too much to define. And also remember that the compact itself was finally negotiated in 1985 and 1986. It didn't take effect until 1994, and so the time between the negotiation, say in 1986 and 2009, you're talking about 23 years. So it's hard to project that far into the future what assistance Palau might need. When the negotiations between the United States and the government of Palau began, and actually began under the Remengesau administration with the Bush administration in Washington, the product of those discussions was a view on the part of the State Department of the United States, the U.S. government, that no further assistance should be provided to Palau other than the continuation of federal programs that operate here, U.S. domestic federal programs that provide Palau with assistance of about $18 million a year. That's a substantial amount. But that the government of the United States should not provide further direct assistance to the government of Palau, that Palau should rely on the trust fund and its own resources. Palau should economize in its spending. Palau should improve its revenue through better tax collection, charging more for water and electricity and so forth. And that's the situation that President Teribiang inherited when he became president and asked Ambassador Koshiba to join him as the Compact Review ambassador. The president went to Washington in February of 2009 and met with my former boss, Hillary Clinton, who is now the Secretary of State. I believe he was the first Pacific Island leader to meet with her, and I think the first Pacific Island leader to ever meet on a one-on-one basis with a U.S. Secretary of State. And I know from Secretary Clinton, whom I continue to be in contact with, I know how impressed she was with President Teribiang during that meeting. And in February, also, then the United States agreed to offer Palau $59 million in assistance for the next 15 years, that is from 2010 through 2024, when there would be another compact review according to the compact. President Teribiang, Ambassador Koshiba, felt was not an adequate amount for the needs of Palau. The compact says that again, there's a review of the relationship as a whole and a review of what the needs are Palau for further U.S. assistance. So they approached me, as the president mentioned. Sandra Pirantosi was the Minister of State at that point. I heard from her at Ambassador Koshiba and the president's request. And because I had worked on the compact, overseeing the negotiations, because I worked so hard on the legislation to approve the compact, and we all remember, I hope Palauans remember, what a difficult approval that was here, not in Palau as well as in the Congress of the United States. A lot of very tragic occurrences that took a number of years to approve the compact. And so I think sometimes as people talk about the time it's taking to approve the compact review agreement that would define terms for the compact and free association through 2024, that people should remember how difficult and how long it took in the U.S. Congress and here in Palau to get the approval of the original compact legislation. And so I agreed to join the team to represent Palau in Washington on the compact review agreement. I also brought with me a colleague. I don't do this alone, although I do a lot of it. I have a partner. My partner is named Jerry Weller. Jerry was a member of Congress, of the U.S. Congress, from the state of Illinois, a Republican. I'm a Democrat, obviously. Jerry was a member of Congress from 1994 until 2009. And he was a member of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, which is the committee of the House of Representatives that has lead jurisdiction over the Compact Review Agreement. And he was also a member of the Committee on Ways and Means, which is the most powerful committee of the Congress. So we we picked up the negotiations with that offer having been increased by the U.S. government from Palau from the $0 was a firm position that had been received at the beginning of at the end of the Remengosau administration, and as President Teribiang took office, had been increased to $59 million, and we began a series of meetings. And I want to just look at some of the documents that I brought with me to recall and quote from. And here is one from Alcee Frelich, was the State Department official who was in charge of the interagency negotiations on the part of the U.S. side, and that she gave to the president in February. The president's budget contained only $59 million in direct assistance for Palau for the next 15 years, as I mentioned. When she wrote this later in 2009, the United States, after I had gone to Secretary Clinton and said this is a totally inadequate amount if you look at the needs of Palau, and it's arbitrary. The amount was not based on any review of what the needs of Palau were. It was just a number that they came up with to meet the convenience of their budget. And so Ms. Frelich wrote, the United States is now prepared to offer Palau direct assistance of up to $168 million over the next 15 years, including $66.5 million in budgetary assistance over an 8-year period. And I then had to go back to consulting with the President, the Ambassador, and the other members of the Compact Review Advisory Group, and on this offer, and we then went to another negotiating session. I want to mention about the Compact Review Advisory Group and Ambassador Koshiba. I think it was one of the wisest decisions that the President made in the negotiations process, not hiring me, but was encouraging Joshua Koshiba to be the Compact Review Ambassador and appointing a very distinguished group of leaders of Palau to be a Compact Review Advisory Group. And people from the private sector, business people, as well as people from government, Dr. Telai from the Palau Community College, Dr. Kwartai, the Minister of Health, the Vice President, who is a very thoughtful and serious and very careful guardian of the budget of Palau and Palau's economics. And so we went back to Secretary Clinton again after consulting with the President and the Compact Review Advisory Group, and said that this $168 million offer was not acceptable to Palau. And that later led to a third offer, not counting the $0 offer and just federal programs. And that third offer was for $178.5 million for Palau. And at that time, and I remember the President came to New York for a meeting of the United Nations General Assembly, and I flew up from Washington, and Ms. Frelich, who's the negotiator for the United States, came to meet with the President at Palau's mission at the UN, and she said something that she also put in a letter, and that was, and I'll read from the letter, Palau's receipt of additional funding and access to U.S. federal services, grants, and programs will be at the very least delayed, and she really was suggesting ended, if Palau did not accept this offer of $178 million. She later wrote to Ambassador Koshiba, the $178.5 million in direct assistance is the firm ceiling offer. In other words, no more money. We're not going to reconsider this at all. Again, in looking at the needs of Palau, the President felt that this was not adequate. This was a very courageous, I think, decision on the part of the President and the Compact Review Advisory Group, Ambassador Koshiba and others, because what Ms. Frelich was saying, if you don't accept this $178.5 million offer, we may discontinue all U.S. assistance, direct grants and federal programs. And this was coming close to the end of a fiscal year, and I remember the discussions very clearly with the President, wondering how serious this threat was, and having to decide whether to do what was right for the people of Palau and fight for a better agreement, or accept this pressure from the U.S. government with respect to this offer. And I again went back to Secretary Clinton and said that the needs of Palau would not be met by this offer. And we then had a long and very difficult process of negotiations in which I met with many officials of the U.S. government executive branch, the Deputy Director of the President's Office of Management and Budget, Rob Neighbors, who's now President Obama's liaison to the U.S. Congress, and many others. The President, we then, and the Deputy Secretary of Interior, as I said, Secretary Clinton's Deputy Chief of Staff, who she assigned to work on this many times. And what we then worked out was a offer of $250 million. And President Teribiang was overseas at this point. I think he was in Manila. I remember reaching him and getting a phone number of where he was in the hotel in Manila because at the request of the U.S. State Department, and in specific for Jacob Lew. Jack is I had worked with in the Clinton White House, as I had worked with Rob Neighbors, who I mentioned, who was the Deputy Director of OMB. At that point, Jack was the Deputy Secretary of State, the number 2 person to Secretary Clinton. He later became the Director of Office of Management and Budget, and he is now President Obama's Chief of Staff. But at this point, he was Deputy Secretary of State, and he called President Teribiang in Manila, and they negotiated and agreed upon the outlines of a $250 million package. And so again, this process of negotiation, which involved the possibility that the U.S. would not provide any further assistance to Palau, started with $0 and federal programs, and went to $59 million in federal programs, went to $168 million in federal programs, $178.5 million in federal programs, and finally to $250 million in federal programs. And I understood from Secretary Clinton that this was probably as far as she was going to be able to push this. What was agreed upon by Deputy Secretary Lew and President Teribiang in their one-on-one telephone final negotiation was the outlines of a package. But there were a number of details. You know, they say the devil is in the details. And there are a number of details of the package that we were still concerned about from the Palauan side. For example, the United States was included in its offer $2 million a year to maintain infrastructure in Palau, public works, like the compact road, the airport, and so forth.
Okay, Jeff, excuse me, I would like to ask you if I can summarize the history of this to the Palauan people. Mm-hmm. Let me ask this one question before I switch to Palauan language. When President Teribiang came in and the Remangasa administration is going toward the end of that administration, what I think I'm trying to get is that there was zero agreement.
Yes.
No, the United States said no deal. Then, the position of the United States government said, well, $500 million for 15 years is gone, and you have to do it like the way it's supposed to be, meaning trust fund and all of that. But there were no money in there. So President Johnson Teribiang came in, and we went from 59 to 168 to 178.5 to 250. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, let me explain to the Palauan people how it started, because there's a lot of confusion in the public, that there was money there before he came in. No. Ale meku aisrmi mas marubak lo reng setial program. El wasei ngakita Jeff Farrow, el gal Jeff el anga am saudra history tialudo de los 100,000 gran em octubre tial 250 million. Madiswak lo el corading mai que el al malmei sumok motogor belau eu aisrmi wasei seral gotel momrek seral lapse sel first compact September 30, 2009. Zero. Dia kaudod, dia ka agreement tra United States makabalment belau. E solang esera bolstata al dadu. Ya seguid en silis pa kosipa. Mloringi seguid al other lo se compact review. Maselo kotlo urlilul meskid. Alin le zero sera al sispa President Toribio. Temiskida 59 million. Et mga lo bangela Jeff solat mga mon 168 million. Say around 2. Et mga mo 178.5 million. Mergo sa igidral ngara huiriping President Johnson Toribio lo mrolel mara Washington. E solang niame ekol keda Jeff lo seng ekol. Etong clean mo 250 million. 250 million. Ang gagawin Jacob Lu, kaya ako talmeredra Office Budget and Management. So lang saygid lo 250 million. Saya ble stop, kung lo stop saygid, President sa ingungyang. Tila adalo trobal mo kadam tomring irogid. Mang misa instruction ambassador will say that's it. Ndula sa deal. That's a deal. So we stopped at 250 million. Saygid a history tiagid al compact to. Kagida Jeff lo say hindi mlaka, although the mlaka agreement na Miguel mla otia position ringi lo say ndiak, although the adlut la do. Elang saygid la 250. Eso lang ang tane cap ringi 250 million. Mlomra la aldo esera September 10, 2000, no September 3rd, September 3rd, 2010. So lang at timlesan na sige agreemental base ra $250 million minus 28 million for post office. Masaygi dire lang a history tiagi del compact to ngora ati delo reng selwasen taanga mala credit tial toy leng dimla ka udod matimla ka agreement seral sisbat chanso. Okay? Ikadum lesto sige $250 million and that's where we at. And then Jeff continue on working with the United States government by briefing us where we at and what they're doing. So up until today, he's briefing us of the status of this agreement. Okay? Jeffrey, just stay where you're at, and then we give a line to President. He's going to comment, and then back to you, okay? Okay, Mr. President.
Serul Lubongol offer 178.5 million alamay, yabela laram tangalarael. Kadungutyang,
I say.
Ada kadu risk, chance say, ngasongos. Mga umrolek mora Taipei mo guest speaker World League for Human Rights and Freedom. Yang ara Manila ratu tao yung ora Jacob Lu. Then Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. Lo offer 250 mutya package egor biu. Endi ko masaw dringi radi abingel tialudo. Godungura January 2010 mengil mo September 3 2010. And they're saying an agreement and clear a compact review agreement. So now I turn the floor over to Jeff. How we packaged it in the in Hawaii.
Oh no, Jeff. Excuse me. Before we go to you, okay. Mr. President, I want to take just a second of your time and announce to the public that your ambassador, our ambassador to the Republic of China, Mr. Peter Adelbai, his credentials were accepted by President Ma with the assistance of. Minister of Foreign Affairs, Timothy. His name is Timothy.
Timothy Yang.
Yang, yeah, Timothy Yang. So now he is our ambassador, for from Palau to Republic of China. Okay, thank you. All right, back to you, Jeff.
Congratulations. So as we explained, by January 2010, we had an agreement on how much money the United States government would provide and the outlines of how this assistance would be provided. But the devil was in the details. For example, the offer from Deputy Secretary of State Liu that the President accepted included $2 million a year for maintaining infrastructure like the compact road and the airport and other infrastructure. When we received the written proposal from the Department of State that provided further details, that $2 million a year would only be provided if Palau also contributed $2 million a year to maintain the road and the airport. And there were concerns in the government of Palau about that because Palau didn't have the resources to provide an additional $2 million a year for public works on its own. Also, there was other infrastructure that was important to Palau that the president and Ambassador Koshiba and other members of the Compact Review Advisory Group wanted to make eligible for use of the $2 million a year. And so we then had negotiations on the exact details of the Compact Review Agreement. In almost 2 years ago exactly, a little bit more than that, I received a call from Kurt Campbell, who's the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and the Pacific. And he was on his way he was literally getting on the plane to go to Vanuatu, where there was a Pacific Island leaders meeting, and President Turibiang was going there as well. And Kurt asked me to call the president and urge him to sign the latest detailed proposal from the U.S. government on the Compact Review Agreement. And I told him that I would pass on the message to the president, but I thought that what we needed another negotiating session to work on some of these detailed issues. In Vanuatu, Assistant Secretary Campbell met with President Turibiang and really got the same message. And as a result of the discussion in Vanuatu, there was a meeting in Honolulu in the last days of August of 2010, beginning of September of 2010, with Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Frankie Reed, where we negotiated the final details of the Compact Review Agreement and obtained a number of changes that made it more favorable to Palau. As we were having that meeting, I heard from Secretary Clinton, and she urged me to try to make sure that this meeting was the final meeting of the negotiation of the Compact Review Agreement, because she was concerned that there was a congressional election coming up in 2 months in November of 2010, and it looked to her and it looked to me and most political observers that the leadership of the House of Representatives would change from Democrat to Republican. And the significance of that was that during the whole process of our negotiations with the executive branch of the United States, beginning with President Turibiang's first trip to Washington, D.C. in February of 2009, we had also been working with the committees and leaders of the Congress on the issue of the Compact Review, why it was important, how the negotiations were going, and members of Congress were very helpful to us during the process of negotiations. The president or I or Ambassador Koshiba would say something in the negotiations, and we would have members of Congress write to the Department of State in support of our position. And the lead on that were the Democrats, who had the majority in the House and the Senate. But what Secretary Clinton was saying is the House was probably going to go Republican, and we should try to get the negotiations done so we could get the Compact Review Agreement legislation passed by the Congress in 2010. And as I said, the agreement was signed in Honolulu on September 3rd, 2010 by the President and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Frankie Reed. During this process, the President had been in communication, met with himself, with several very key senators and representatives to the process. Of course, there were Senators Inouye and Akaka of Hawaii, who are always sensitive to Pacific Island needs. But there was also Jeff Bingaman, the senator from New Mexico, who is the chairman of the Committee on Energy and Natural Resources in the Senate, which is the committee that has jurisdiction over the compact and compact review legislation. And in addition to Senator Bingaman, who is the chairman of the committee, the president met with Lisa Murkowski, who is the ranking minority member, the lead Republican on that committee. He met with Senator McCain, who is the ranking Republican on the Armed Services Committee and who has been out to Palau and is I can tell you, a great admirer of Ambassador Koshiba's based on his time here in Palau. Met with Senator Jim Webb of Virginia. Senator Webb is chairman of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific. He also met with several leaders in the House of Representatives. He met with then chairman of the Natural Resources Committee, Ray Hall. He met with the ranking Republican of that committee, who's now the chairman of the committee, Doc Hastings. Met with the representatives in the House of Representatives from Hawaii and delegates from the territories. He also met with Secretary of Interior Salazar. And so we wanted to make sure that we had all of the congressional support that we might need when the compact review legislation was done. As I said, Secretary Clinton advised that she wanted to get the compact review legislation approved by the U.S. Congress in late 2010 before the leadership of the House of Representatives changed. And we agreed that that was a good strategy. However, after the agreement was signed, the U.S. executive branch took a long time in drafting the final agreement approval legislation. And I don't want to go into too much detail, but there were differences between the Department of the Interior and Department of State on exactly how that legislation should be drafted that contributed to the delay. The agreement legislation was not submitted to the Congress until January of 2011, when the new Congress took effect. And this became very significant, not only because the new Congress had a Republican majority in the House of Representatives and a majority that was comprised of what are now called Tea Party members who were elected to the Congress of the United States on the proposition of cutting federal taxes, cutting federal spending, cutting the budget, and creating no new programs or spending. And these Tea Party members in particular got the rules of the House of Representatives changed and got a law enacted that applied to the Senate that required that any new spending be offset, be paid for dollar by either a cut in another federal program or increased taxes, and they also took a pledge that they were opposed to any new increased taxes. So in other words, in order to get any new spending approved by the Congress as of 2011 for this Congress, there has to be a cut in federal spending equal dollar for dollar to what the new spending would be. This has resulted in this Congress of the United States, the one that's from 2011 to 2012, being the least productive Congress within memory, because the Democrats and Republicans can't agree on how to approve any matters that have a budgetary impact, and the Democrats want to pay for new programs by increasing taxes. Republicans want to only pay for new programs by cutting existing programs, and there has been almost nothing agreed to, and almost all the legislation that has passed just continues current spending. So one of the first things that we did was to work with the appropriations committees of the Congress, and the President met with, for example, Senator Inouye, who chairs the Appropriations Committee in the Senate, to ensure that as time went on, during the debate over how to pay for the Compact Review Agreement, that the U.S. government and the Congress would continue to appropriate money to Palau as if there were a compact review agreement, providing the level of support that had been provided the last year of the compact itself, 2009. And we've been successful.
That's very important, Jeff. So let me just say a
Okay.
few words about why we continue to receive direct assistance and federal grants since 2009. Because when I went to Washington in February or March of 2009, I was accompanied by my then Secretary of State, Minister of State, Sandra Pierantozzi, and Stuart Beck, Ambassador to the United Nations, and we met with key congressmen from the House and the Senate. I met with the Secretary of Interior, Salazar, and at that time we were assured by the United States government that in spite of the termination of financial assistance to Palau beyond September 30th, 2009, U.S. will continue to provide financial assistance to Palau directly along with federal grants and programs beyond that, pending the negotiations and the approval of the Compact Review Agreement even before the negotiations began. And we are very grateful to the United States for that. Let me speak in Palauan. Mesera Gibora, Washington, D.C., February to March 2009, yang nos mamal sa Senator Inoue, lingia Chairman Senate Committee on Ways and Means, mar staff House, mar Congressman House of Representatives, nom sa Secretary Interior Salazar, ang iluag nira Brigel was it tumalmol mlom skita igel direct finance assistance in Blue Belau, ma federal grants and programs, igitam sa the compact review, misil agreement. Isigital to kamal mol al sales, igitam mo mangas still compact review package raw rural Kenya Congress. In English, I said that we continue to receive direct financial assistance from the United States, and then when the compact review agreement is approved by the Congress, then what Palau has received shall be deducted from the financial package of the compact review agreement. Thank you.
That's absolutely correct. And what we've had to do, Mr. President, as you know, is every year I go to Senator Noe as chairman of the Appropriations Committee, to Congressman Simpson, who's chairman of the Interior Appropriations Committee in the House of Representatives, and other members of Congress, and ask them to continue for another year funding at that same level. And I'm pleased to report, and the congressional staff said this yesterday, and I've advised you and Ambassador Koshiba, who's joined us in the past weeks, that we've reached agreement with leaders of the appropriations committees in the Congress that in September they will pass legislation that will continue for another 6 months the current level of funding for Palau, which will be credited against the Compact Review Agreement from the beginning of the start of the new fiscal year, which is October 1st, and then continue for another 6 months while we work on the Compact Review legislation. We have met with countless numbers of members of Congress and their staffs, up to the leadership of the Congress, Republican as well as Democrat, and received unanimous support for the Compact Review Agreement. And there's not one member of Congress who has expressed any concern after the work that we have done with the President and Ambassador Koshiba and hearings that we've had. For example, in June 2011, President Teribiang testified at a hearing before the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, chaired by Senator Bingaman and ranking Republican Senator Murkowski. There are representatives there from the Department of Defense, Department of Interior, Department of State, the Government Accountability Office, but the star witness was President Teribiang, and convinced members of that committee at that point to support the Compact Review Agreement. through the process of our lobbying, as I said, we have received support from every member of Congress we have spoken with about this, Democrat and Republican, senator and representative and delegate and resident commissioner, whatever member of Congress. The Republicans, as I explained, said, we support this, we're ready to vote for it as soon as the Obama administration tells us where in the budget they will cut to pay for it. And the Obama administration first responded by saying that the president had submitted a balanced budget to the Congress, and that balanced budget included money for the Compact Review Agreement as well as the costs of the agreement. The Republicans and Democrats then wrote back and said, no, under congressional rules, you have to make specific identification of how you're going to pay for the costs of what is really a new program. And so by that time, Jack Lew, who had become director of the Office of Management and Budget, and the Obama administration submitted some suggestions to Congress of changes in programs of the Department of the Interior that would pay the costs of the Compact Review Agreement. The most notable one is, and I'll just mention it, but you don't need to know too much detail about it, is called Mineral Net Receipts Sharing. And what this has to do with is the federal government, through the Department of the Interior, owns a lot of land in the United States. And businesses want to mine for coal on that land or drill for oil or gas. And they pay a fee to the United States federal government to be able to do that mining. And that fee is shared by the federal government and state governments. And so the Obama administration proposed changing how that fee money is allocated between the federal government and the state governments to keep more of the money in the federal government to pay for the Compact Review Agreement. Members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans in both the House and the Senate, objected to that proposal, particularly members of Congress from states that had a lot of coal mining and oil and gas drilling, because their states were going to lose revenue. Members who specifically said, we support the Compact Review Agreement, but we don't want to lose money for our state to pay for it. We then asked the administration to come up with an alternative of how to pay for the Compact Review Agreement. Last November 30th, there was a hearing in the House Asia and the Pacific Subcommittee on the Compact Review Agreement legislation, chaired by Don Manzullo of Illinois and Eni Faleomavaenga, the delegate from American Samoa, both of whom supported the agreement legislation. And Chairman Manzullo said at that time that if the U.S. executive branch didn't identify another way of paying for the Compact Review Agreement, he would come up with some ideas. And that's eventually what happened. And in June, he proposed cutting a number of programs of the U.S. State Department to pay for the Compact Review Agreement. The U.S. State Department, of course, objected to having other programs cut to pay for the Compact Review Agreement legislation, while stating their support for the legislation. And then we made a suggestion, myself on behalf of Palau, for something that had passed the Senate of the United States in other legislation, but not been passed by the House of Representatives. And this would be a law that would deny passports to people who owed taxes to the U.S. federal government in excess of $50,000. And the idea was that because these people would want to get their passports, it would encourage them to pay their taxes. This cost offset proposal to pay for the Compact Review Agreement was accepted by the members of the Asia and Pacific Subcommittee of the House, and also by the chairwoman of the full House Foreign Affairs Committee, and they approved it in July. One of the reasons that they acted in July was that Ambassador Koshiba sent a letter to the U.S. Ambassador to Palau, Helen Reed Rowe, in which he recounted the history of the debate between the Congress and the President and the President's people on the cost offset, and wanted to know very strongly from Ambassador Reed Rowe whether the executive branch of the United States was going to play get more engaged in the negotiation of a cost offset. And that letter was a very helpful letter in getting the executive branch to sit down at the table with members of Congress and with ourselves in working out cost offset legislation. And that led to the approval of the legislation to approve the compact with some enhancements and some improvements that we sought for Palau that we hope can go the process of negotiation, including increasing a slight increase in the amount of money in the package that would depend upon inflation in the future, having the U.S. government pay for auditing of compact funds, and language to ensure that mail to Palau only require U.S. domestic stamps rather than international stamps. So I want to thank Ambassador Koshiba, who's joined us, for writing that letter. Sometimes in negotiations, you have to be strong and forthright and tough, and sometimes you're more collegial, but in a negotiating process, people have to know that you're going to stand up for yourself and not just accept the way the other side is willing to treat you. The U.S. executive branch had been very stubborn in its position of saying that this net receipt sharing proposal was the way to pay for the compact review agreement. Let me say that I think the net receipt sharing proposal is a fine proposal, but that's not the issue, whether it was a good proposal or not. The issue was whether Congress would accept it. And so Palau came up with an alternative. That alternative is being looked at. We had, as we've said at the beginning of the program, Democratic and Republican staff from the House and Senate committees here yesterday in Palau in a very extraordinary trip because they flew, as I did, directly from Washington to Palau without stopping except to change planes. It's a 27-hour trip. They stayed in Palau for one day, and they got back on the plane and flew back to Washington, another 27-hour trip. And I can tell you that traveling 27 hours straight is not a pleasant experience. And they did it for the same reason that Assistant Secretary Campbell came out here a few weeks ago, which was to deliver this message, that there is universal support for the Compact Review Agreement in the U.S. government, in the executive branch, State Department, Interior Department, Defense Department, and in the Congress of the United States, in the House and the Senate, among Democrats and Republicans. The only delaying factor in approving the Compact Review Agreement legislation is this question of how to pay for the legislation unrelated to the provisions to Palau. This is not a unique situation with respect to this legislation. It is true of almost every piece of legislation now in the Congress. I was just thinking last night about a program that I'm interested in. It's called the Violence Against Women's Act. And it's a very successful program, has support from Democrats and Republicans in the House and the Senate as well. And it applies in the United States. And the purpose of the program is to protect against violence against women. And as I said, it's been very successful in the way it's operated. There is nobody who does not support extending the Violence Against Women's Act in the Congress. But it, like the Compact Review Agreement legislation, has been caught up in the question of how to pay for it, what is going to be cut in the federal budget. to pay for the Violence Against Women's Act in the United States. So what we're dealing with is you can cite program after program that is deemed important by members of Congress, and it's the same situation. And a lot of it relates to the election that we're going to hold on November 6th in the United States, the same day that you're holding an election in Palau. Democrats, as I said, want to have some tax increases to pay for these programs. Republicans only want to pay for the programs by cutting other programs and want to continue to have taxes at the current level. And that disagreement is not going to be resolved until this election. That's the key issue of the election between President Obama and Governor Romney, and between Democrats and Republicans in the Congress. And so there are a lot of measures that people believe are important, that everybody has agreed upon, that they're waiting until after the election to approve, when there will be what's called a lame duck session of the Congress. Lame duck because some of the congressmen will be lame ducks since they will have been defeated or they will have retired. And the hope is that in between the election and the time of the new Congress, there can be a lot of this legislation that's already been agreed to in substance will be voted on for final approval. And the Palau legislation, we're going to try to get the Palau legislation approved before Congress goes out October 4th for the election through this cost offset that I've proposed or through some other idea. Literally this morning, I was emailing with the Office of the Majority Leader of the House of Representatives, Eric Cantor, about the cost offset proposal, and he's saying that some people on the Ways and Means Committee, which is the tax committee of the House of Representatives, like the idea of this passport denial if you owe more than $50,000 in taxes, but that some people on the Ways and Means Committee want to use that to help pay to continue the lower tax rates the Democrats want to raise. So there, Al Stamen from the Senate Energy Committee was saying we have to be careful that nobody steals this idea to use for something else. There is universal support for the agreement. Not one member of Congress has questioned the agreement. Bipartisan, House and Senate, a whole long list of senators and representatives who've publicly spoken for the agreement, and there is this budgetary complication. And we have reached agreement with the appropriations committees, and Chairman Simpson of the Interior Appropriations Committee met Jerry Weller, former Congressman Weller, my partner, and I met with him about a month ago, and he's a Republican who is very conservative, wants to cut the budget, but he said, let me assure you that as long as I'm chairman of this subcommittee on Interior Appropriations, I'm going to continue to I want the Compact Review Agreement approved, but I'm going to find money from elsewhere to continue to fund Palau, other Interior Department programs, to continue to fund essential assistance to Palau for government services until the legislation is approved. The President Turibyong met with Chairman Inouye of the Senate Appropriations Committee a year ago as well, and got the same message. So Kurt Campbell from the U.S. State Department was here and said the same thing. And why is there this support for the agreement and for Palau? There is a, I think in the President's words, there is a covenant that was formed through blood between the United States and Palau through the sacrifice of so many American Marines and others during World War II in liberating Palau from Japanese colonialism. There were 50 years of U.S. administration of Palau during the trusteeship, in which Palauans became very close to the United States and modeled your government after the government of the United States, adopted a lot of U.S. institutions and practices, democratic practices, and Many Palauans have gone to school in the United States. So those were foundations that helped build the Compact of Free Association and between the United States and Palau. But of course, there are other interests that the United States had. The primary one, and continues to be, is the strategic interest of the United States. And I'm going to, I don't know if Senator Diaz, if you can show something that if this can be seen. And I don't know if you can zoom in on it, but I'll explain it. And what I'm showing you now is a map from the U.S. Department of Defense. And you see two lines here. This is not a U.S. government map. It is in English, and it was produced by the U.S. Defense Department. But it's something that we, from Palau, obtained that's actually a Chinese naval map. And this is a reproduction of the Chinese naval map, identical in English. We provided it to the U.S. Department of Defense. They verified it, reading the Chinese, and it shows these two lines. And the first line is a first island chain, which is the defense line that the Chinese want to ensure that they have their naval influence to be able to protect China. And the second line is the second island chain, which is where they want to project their influence into the Pacific. And if you look here, if you can see this, they've circled Palau as an objective to increase Chinese influence. And they are very closely watching the negotiations of the Compact of Free Association. And Chinese, it's very clear, and the President and the Ambassador Koshiba know this, that there are people that the Chinese would be willing to provide assistance to Palau if Palau would move away from the United States and enable them to have the access they want right now. Palau, these islands, you have the most beautiful islands in the world. The islands are relatively small. But Palau not only controls its islands, but it controls the waters around Palau under international law. Yes, as the President is saying, that it is the size of the state of Texas of the United States, one of the largest states of the United States. So Palau has a very important strategic value. And if you look at this island chain, you'll see Japanese islands down to the Northern Mariana Islands, Guam, and of course the Chinese and the Japanese have their disputes about naval control. And then you have U.S. territories of Northern Marianas and Guam. And then you have the FSM, YAP in particular, and the Compact of Free Association gives the United States exclusive military rights in that. And then below Palau, you have Indonesia, which also the Chinese would have to deal with. So they're looking very closely at Palau.
By the way, the Chinese offered a huge investment for YAP, almost unreasonable for the size of YAP, a resort investment.
As the there was a briefing. The Defense Department had a briefing of the China caucus of the Congress. There's a caucus of members of Congress who are concerned about China's growing influence, and General Simcock, who was the head of the policy office of the Department of Defense for East Asia and the Pacific, and explained what the Chinese strategy was, and that this is really not as much a military strategy as what it is an economic strategy for developing the economy of China. They want to be able to have better sea access to other countries like India, where they can obtain natural resources to develop the economy of China. which of course is a very direct competitor with the economy of the United States. So that's a reason for U.S. government interest. And now I'm showing you another map, and see if we can get this right. And this map is from a front page story in the Washington Post that appeared on August 2nd, this month on the 2nd. The Washington Post is the largest newspaper in Washington, D.C., read by every member of Congress. And what the article is about the U.S. government's and the Department of Defense plans in the event of war between China and the United States. No one thinks that there will be war, and no one wants war. No one believes that either the Chinese or the United States want war. But a prudent military makes plans for any contingency. And if you look at this map, you will see again the same two lines with respect to China across the Pacific. Again, Palau is highlighted among the islands because of its strategic importance. And the article itself also says that in the event of a war, which would be an air-sea war between China and the United States, the plans of the Pentagon would want to move planes to both Palau and Tinian. You know, as I think most people probably know, there's a major Air Force base and naval in Guam right now, Andersen Air Force Base. Obviously, that might be a target. Andersen is mentioned on this map. So the war planners at the Defense Department, in the event of the unforeseen and what no one wants to occur, want to be ensure that they can move their planes to Palau for such a war. And again, the same two lines of China's strategy, China's interests in projecting into the Pacific. So that's a major concern to many members of Congress as well as the executive branch of the United States. They won't say it the way I'm saying it, but that's, you know, I know that based on our meetings with them. And of course, we all, China and the United States government want a very positive engagement. There's another reason why Palau has become so important to the United States and continuing free association. And I'm going to show you another graphic if I could, and if you can see it. And if it shows up well, and particularly this chart here, if you can read it. And with this chart is taken from a report by the U.S. Department of State a few months ago to the Congress on voting in the United Nations. And under the Derived administration, the United States and Palau have voted together more than any other two countries have voted with the United States. You can see Palau is listed as number 1 on voting with the U.S. Then FSM, Nauru, Israel, Canada, the Marshall Islands are the top. And I have similar charts for 2010 and 2009 during the Derived administration. And I know that Secretary Clinton in particular appreciates this as well. And it's very important, I'm sorry, I'm going to show you the chart one more time. It's very important because of this column, which is important to the United States. And that is in the UN, votes against Israel and votes for the Arab states and the Palestinians. And Palau votes 100% of the time with the United States and Israel.
And the average is about 40.
The average country votes with the United States on Israel issues 4.1%. In other words, 96% of the time they vote against the United States and Israel. Palau votes with the United States and Israel 100% of the time. On the 10 most important votes in 2011 in the UN, Palau voted with the United States 100% of the time. The average country voted with the U.S. 52.3% of the time. In other words, 47% of the time they were voting against the United States in the United Nations. So that's very important to the United States as well. And it's
Let me ask you, Jeff,
yeah.
about Manzulo's interest in Palau in connection with Israel, and the chairman of the committee from Florida, Rose Layton,
Yeah.
and the United Nations votes.
These United Nations votes are very important, not to any member of Congress, but Republicans in particular are very strong, as well, Democrats and Republicans are all very strong supporters of Israel in the Congress. As you may know, the U.S. government is actually discontinuing some contributions to the UNESCO, the United Nations Economic, Social, and Cultural Organization, because of UNESCO's recognition of Palestine as a state, and which is opposed by members of Congress. And so Chairman Manzullo of the House Asia Pacific Subcommittee, who's a Republican, Chairwoman Ross Layton, who is the chair of the full Foreign Affairs Committee, and almost every Republican you'll speak to are very concerned about this. Chairwoman Ross Layton, originally her family is from Cuba, and she has two issues that she's most concerned about. And that is democracy for Cuba, which is still under communist dictatorship and the only non-democratic country left in the Western Hemisphere, and protection of Israel. And she has large numbers of her constituents, people in her district, which is Miami, Florida, are Cuban Americans and Jewish Americans who are also concerned about Israel or about Cuba. And when I showed her this chart, she couldn't believe. And she said, this is a story that every member of Congress should know, how important Palau's votes are at the UN to the U.S. And there's not a member of Congress who has not been impressed by this. I mentioned that I was just emailing with the foreign policy advisor for Eric Cantor, who is the majority leader of the House of Representatives, the Republican majority leader. Eric Cantor is Jewish as well. He's also a leader of the Tea Party group in the Congress, the most conservative people who want to cut the budget, cut spending. He's a big supporter of approving this legislation, and his staff are working as of last night our time, because it's now nighttime in Washington, but as of last night they were still working on trying to negotiate agreements on this offset proposal. There's also a great appreciation in Congress of Palauans who have joined the armed forces. I was surprised in the hearing that Chairman Manzullo held when General Simcock testified. He said that their calculations from the Defense Department are that Palauans enlist in the U.S. military at a higher rate than residents of any state or territory of the United States. And Palauans sadly have sacrificed their lives or their limbs in U.S. peacekeeping missions abroad. And so there's great appreciation for that. People are impressed in some of the meetings that I go to with Palau's ambassador to the United States, Hersey Kyoto. Ambassador Kyoto has two children who are in the U.S. military. I know Ambassador Koshiba has a son who's in the U.S. military and is in Afghanistan right now. So that's very much appreciated. The sum total of all of this, and this is a long explanation of what's going on because it's hard to understand, but the sum total again is that we have gotten a huge increase from 0 to 59 million to 168 million to 178.5 million to $250 million plus federal programs that are valued at $18 million a year in a compact review agreement, in agreement with the executive branch of the U.S. We have gotten members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans who agree on very little, senators and members of the House of Representatives, all to support this legislation. We, like other issues like the Violence Against Women's Act, are held up by these new cost offset rules that are preventing Democrats and Republicans from passing even legislation that they support. We've gotten, despite that, Democrats like Senator Inouye and Republicans like Congressman Simpson, the appropriations leader in the House, to agree to continue to appropriate money to Palau that will count towards the agreement until the agreement can be formally approved. So I think this is a great success story for Palau and Washington, attributable to the diplomacy of President Turibiang, who has impressed every member of Congress and every executive branch official with whom we've dealt. It is a tribute to Ambassador Koshiba, who is a very skilled negotiator, and he knows when to be tough and when not to be tough, and I hope it's due a little bit to the help that we've given the president and the ambassador and Palau's other leaders in Washington. Palauans should rest assured, I believe, that the Compact Review Agreement, as the politics of the United States Congress and the President get sorted out, the Compact Review Agreement is going to be approved. It's going to be honored until it is formally approved. And this really, it should not be a question in anyone's mind. So that's a long explanation. I hope it's been helpful and informative and answered questions, but I'm sure some people may have questions, and I'm happy to help to try to answer them as well.
Let me take the floor from Jeff and thank him. Actually, I would attribute a lot of the hard work and great skills and diplomacy to Jeff and his team in Washington. They deal with Ambassador Koshiba almost on a daily basis to report on the progress that is being made in Washington. And also I'd like to pay my respect to Ambassador Koshiba for his leadership in these negotiations. And I would like him to introduce the members of his team who have worked with him since 2009 to navigate through this difficult process. I know there's former Congressman Policar Basilis, but I think Joshua should identify those people who work with him. But I want to thank Jeff Farrow for his hard and skillful work in Washington. He knows the staff of the Congress, he knows Hillary Clinton, he has personal contacts with Hillary, Secretary of State, and key members of Congress. So I want to thank him. Whenever I go to Washington, he accompanies me and make arrangements for me to get to meet these important players in Washington. So thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Okay, at this time I would like to, since Ambassador Koshiba just joined us, I would like to see if any comments or he wants to say a few words before we give the line to the public to ask questions. Senator Koshiba.
Just introduce the members of your team.
Ambassador.
Senator, President Toribong Siral Eskarngagal mo compact review negotiator. Actually, once again, I pick people who don't treat the other involved in first compact. And dilo definitely Policar Basilis one, George Ngirasaul Gim Dilagal Mategit. Aringile the governor Emily Gint Esenclela. And the May Obak, a Maktube Sanclip. Gil the May Obaka, Cora leader, Tigil Adra Blue, the Renacal involved government at that time. Ma Isagrabay, speaker, a legislature, a pletrain brewing Gora. I was still mixa member. Madolaba input Rablu me. Di ngada Dr. Quartey, Dr. Patrick Telei, Sandra Pirianto, Sisera, Minister of State Minister Membera. Sandra, by the way, I give them dagal negotiate a first compact. Jeff got to know Sandra at the time, chairman de Lugora, subcommittee insular affair, Aulora compact. Sandra gim dagal mom nestabra Senate. Binor uegil diregal after bol member kamame president Toribio ang iltin mo ambassador mo si Abal emang purwam lo si alin dia kamola ang klik aktif member dikti ambassador mo si Abal definitely her sikyota tarah malgi mo speri ng Washington ingi ma waje Pablo el kam negate sen la message sen mereka tatara member lagu besina daktoriano ngi minister state la ubang kamam Cuarte, of course, Dr. Cuarte, by the way, Dr. Cuarte, Dr. Patrick Telei será presidente del GOT, Aldo Imar Adam Miguel Guerrero Wiggers, te digan a Guantanamo, Cuarte, Kevin Kirk, Patrick, were sent to Washington to check these people Uyghurs. Amne moktegra Cuarte o meselo sengara rak tangar tirgal merbelang molto multir other belau. That's why Cuarte went. And plus those people need to be educated. That's why Patrick Telei went there to check them. And definitely Kevin Kirk is our legal counselor. No check technical. President Trigger member every other 2 weeks giguk meet. Active informal tiragel send Jeff me. By the way, Jeff seragim eskra Jeff join. Akple eskra Sandram contacting. Lengal Jeff long time friend, but those days we don't know what is email and things like that. So I got lost. I lost Jeff. And then Sandra was able to contact him. He requested me, and he was very nice of him to ask his wife permission so he can join us. And it was very nice of Jeff.
What happened to Mike Shannon? I mean, you brought Jeff in, and then Mike Shannon.
Well, Mike was a lawyer for the previous administration, and they were very expensive.
Oh, I see.
He was $25,000 a month, plus he charged all the expense. Plus he hired so-called lobbyists for $15,000, and they didn't do anything. But their approach was to negotiate with Congress. You don't negotiate with other country going through Congress. But this guy was...
Because they did not succeed with the executive, yeah.
Well, yes, because executive branch at the beginning told President Ramasao, saying that it's no talk.
No talk.
Well, President Toribio was worried about that, because if no talk, no money. And he was lucky to get advice from...
Okay. Yeah.
And then went to see Hillary Clinton, and then that's where the process. So we relieved Mike Shannon and his crew 1 month after we took over. Yeah, and the only guy we retained was Kevin O'Keefe, because why? He was an economist, and he was an honest economist. He told me some people have, he managed some high official guys in Palau money, but I didn't want to go detail on that, but he's a money manager, a very good man.
Yeah. Mr. President, I think it's appropriate for you to also extend your congratulations to all the members of CRC. We don't want to leave anybody behind, you know, joint efforts of everybody, you know. And this...
It's a team effort.
Yeah.
In fact, I met Jeffrey Farrow for the first time in Washington when I went to see Hillary Clinton in February of 2009. We were at Michael Shannon's law office.
Yeah.
And Sandra Pirantosi, then Minister of State, phoned Jeffrey, and he walked in. And that's when I met you for the first time.
I see.
And from there, I advised my team that I would like to lay a wreath under the name of Captain John Quintaro, which turned out to be a great opening in my conversation with Secretary Hillary Clinton when I said I went to pay my respect to the American heroes, including a Palauan who died in Vietnam. That changed the climate of the conversation, actually. And that's when I met you. So I have to say thank you to Sandra Pirantosi. she actually helped Jeffrey make a phone call to Congressman Del Lugo, and we spoke to him at the time in Washington.
And I think Ambassador Koshba was right, because when you want someone to talk on our behalf or lobby for us, it's somebody that comes from an island similar to ours. Since it's from Virgin Islands.
And by the way, I like to express my profound gratitude to the Guam delegate, Madeline Bordalio,
Right,
and
right.
Christensen from the Virgin Islands. They are, and Samoa, American Samoa, Falema Vaenga. They are actually on the forefront of our team in Washington, and they're leading the way. So
Yeah.
I want to thank them.
Mr. President, you told me yesterday that this show's going to be 1 hour and 30 minutes, and Jeff took 1 hour and 30 minutes, so the public don't have time left.
It has taken us 2:09 till right now, which is talking about it. It's a long
Okay,
process.
can we open the line for the
Sure,
public to
yeah,
ask a couple
yeah,
questions
yeah,
at least?
Sure.
Fine
Fine.
with me.
It's, time
Jeff
is
would answer, yeah.
not an issue. So it's okay if we take
Sure.
here's the first call. You see this light right over here? When you see blinking, that means somebody on the line. Okay, first call.
Malututa, Senator.
Ngiltu tao. Boko dira radio. Me boko dira radio kau. Okay. Boko dira radio kau. You can't talk with your radio loud because it's going to create that feedback. Okay, Gabo.
Malututa. Kari kamor ngil alada nga pa dalo ase wala positioner ka mora inflation factors. Direct agreement.
Okay, we got that. Please turn off your radio and listen to your telephone. Inflation factors on this $250 million agreement.
The agreement does not include an inflation factor. We, in fact, basically inflated the amount of money that the U.S. executive branch was willing to provide, as I explained, going all the way from zero to $250 million package. So that inflated. However, the legislation that has been approved by the House Foreign Affairs Committee, we got them to add an additional inflation factor to that legislation. Whether or not that additional provision will become part of the final law, I can't tell you, but we're going to try to have that be the case.
Inflation factor is very low.
You're right. Inflation, as a matter of fact, has been very low. There's actually more concern in the U.S. Economists about deflation rather than inflation. Right? Just this year, the Congressional Budget Office, which calculates inflation, has lowered the cost of the amount of inflation twice, their calculation of what inflation is. It's now, I believe, less than, I think, 0.8%, 0.7 of less than 1%. So inflation is not a major issue right now.
I see.
But we hope we can get that done, and we will get this legislation done one way or the other, and then we can talk about other issues and how to improve things for the future as well. This is not the end of the relationship, so.
Yeah.
So in the Manzolo bill, in the House version, there's an inflation factor.
I see.
But actually,
I see.
I'm concerned about deflation,
Uh-huh.
which would reverse the process and lower
Right.
the value of the dollar.
Right, thank
But
you,
there's no
President.
deflation provision, so
okay.
it won't go lower.
There's a senator texting to me twice already. He's concerned about the Chinese. He's afraid of Chinese because we came out in the Taiwan newspaper that Palau is one of the bravest country in the world by accepting the Uyghurs and turn around and kill one of their men when they came into our territory. So, yeah, so this senator here is afraid of our security. Can the United States guarantee that?
Yes, the United States is going to guarantee the security of Palau under this agreement. And the United States will defend Palau as if it were part of the United States
I see.
under this agreement. I think, of course, despite what the Taiwanese newspaper said, Palau didn't kill any Chinese in that incident where Chinese boats came into Palauan waters, an accident when the Fish and Wildlife here were trying to properly enforce the law and get the boat to stop. By accident, Chinese died in that accident. Palau is one of the smallest countries in the world, one of the very smallest. China's, the biggest
in terms of population.
In terms of population and size, and one of the biggest in terms of economy. But Palau, I think, has gained a lot of respect, certainly in Washington, for its willingness to stand up during this Teribiong administration, to stand up for itself and protect its interests in a lot of ways. And so the United States is going to guarantee that security. And what Palauans ought to be more concerned about is the Chinese system, which does not have the democracy, the freedom of speech, elections, freedom of religion that Palauans are used to, and is the reason the bonds between Palau and the United States are really that we share values of democracy and freedom.
I can quote one of the, a letter came from Washington, the Congress, I think. She wrote to President Teribiong saying that your compact agreement is going to be in the good hands and it's going to pass, but we don't know when. But the reason why it's going to pass because Palau relationship with Taiwan, and and also a voting coincidence. Those two I read on that piece of paper. But for Palau, Jeff, being we're not afraid to flex our muscles because we know our big brother is standing on the side in case of something goes wrong. So we really exercise our right and not being afraid of anybody. We're small, but we have a big brother, United States of America.
Let me interrupt and say
Go ahead.
that in your letter to me or email, you mentioned that someone, or I think the Department of Defense mentioned that Palau is quote irreplaceable.
Yes.
Like an aircraft carrier anchored at the right location. Who said that it's irreplaceable?
That was a letter from the Department of Defense, and if you give me a minute, I have it here. And let me just read.
Date.
This letter went in April of last year to Senator Bingaman, who's chairman of the Senate committee that's handling the compact legislation. And he wrote this: failure to follow through on our commitments to Palau, as reflected in the proposed legislation, would jeopardize our defense posture in the Western Pacific. This posture will become increasingly important. And what they're really talking about in this letter from the Undersecretary of Defense, Michelle Flournoy, is they're really talking about vis-a-vis China. And then it went on to say, Palau is an irreplaceable partner and a reinforcement of our shared interest in regional international security. So that's really what the Defense Department is telling members of Congress. And as the President said, you can compare Palau, and as I showed you that map from the Pentagon's war planning, where they would move their planes, you can really think of Palau as a immovable aircraft carrier for the United States in the event stationed in a very strategic location that will keep the balance of power between the United States and China. And you were referring to a letter that came from Chairwoman Ross Lehtinen of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, which and she a few weeks ago. Let me just add this anecdote. I met with Jerry Weller, and I met with John Fleming, who's chairman of the Natural Resources Subcommittee that's handling the compact legislation. And we met right outside the floor of the House of Representatives in a room called the Speaker's Lobby, because they were voting, and so he couldn't go back to his office because there were votes every short period. And into the room came Chairwoman Ross Lehtinen. and she was there to meet with some other people, but she saw me over there and saw Fleming, who's the subcommittee chairman of Natural Resources, and she came over and she spoke in the strongest possible terms about the importance of the legislation, but also, and she said, and they recognize Taiwan, and they vote with us in the UN more than any other country.
Right.
And another one little anecdote I'll give you is that yesterday, and it was mentioned yesterday by Greg Sablon, who's the delegate from the Northern Marianas, Kilili Sablon, who's also been very helpful, and he said something he hadn't told me before. But one of the members of Congress that I went to try to get this legislation supported is Jose Serrano of New York. He's a Democrat from New York. He's never been to Palau. I'm not sure. He's never been to the Pacific, I know for a fact. And he's a senior member of the Appropriations Committee on the Democratic side. And he's also one of the founders of what is called the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, the members of Congress who are Hispanic. And Sablon was saying he was on the floor of the House, and Serrano, who was going to other Hispanic Latino members of Congress from New York, New Jersey, Illinois, Texas, California, and talking to them about the importance of Palau and this agreement legislation, because we had convinced him of that importance. So there are a lot of things going on.
Yeah. There was a question yesterday, Mr. President. Excuse me. There was a question that was asked yesterday by High Chief Ibadul. When we came back from Hawaii in 2010, September, there was misinformation that went to the public, and he asked it yesterday in regards to may enter. May enter. Can you please take your time and explain that one more time to the public that it's not like that? It's a readable passport or something.
Yeah, and
the compact agreement changed the immigration rights or privileges of Palauans.
Right.
The Compact Review Agreement includes language on the right of Palauans to enter the United States, and it includes a number of attachments and subsidiary agreements. And the reason for all of these is to update language. The compact was negotiated in 1985 and 1986. And U.S. laws have changed between 1985, 1986, and 2012. And so all of the changes that are made to conform the compact to current law. With respect to immigration, there is no change in the right of Palauans to enter the United States and work in the United States in this language. The fact that the word is Palauans may enter is not has no legal difference from the current language. It's saying Palauans may enter. The only thing that is added to update and conform with current U.S. law is that in order for anyone to enter the United States, they have to have a machine-readable passport, which is a security measure. And not all countries have machine-readable passports. And Palau used to not have machine-readable passports. The U.S. passports formerly were not machine-readable. The U.S. has instituted a system for security and verification of identity that the passport can be read electronically by a machine. The fact of the matter is that Palau today has machine-readable passports. So all that language did was conform the current situation to the current practice and law, that Palauan passports can be used to enter the United States. Palauans have the same right to enter the United States that they've always had under the compact.
Okay. Jeff, while we're on that issue, one more very important question is that a Palauan or FSM, all FAS, freely associated states, their status with, when they get into the United States is very different than immigrants.
Right.
Can you explain that so they know the difference, that we're not immigrants and we're not qualified for some of these services that the United States government is offering? Can you explain that?
You're not qualified for some, but you are qualified for others. and many services, and people do receive services. And one of the issues has been not with respect to Palau, but with respect to people from another freely associated state, another state freely associated with the U.S. former trust territory area, is that a lot of people have come in, and because they are eligible for some services, in particular people who need kidney dialysis, have been using, have gone to Hawaii for kidney dialysis. Now, Palauans don't do that because the government of Palau has maintained its kidney dialysis machines, and people can receive kidney dialysis here in Palau. But in one of the other states, and really two of the other states, they have not maintained the machinery, and so they have a lot of kidney dialysis machines, but they're not functional. So people have had to go to Hawaii to receive kidney dialysis. But under the compact itself, Palauans can enter the United States in a special status. They can enter without visas. They can enter without restriction. Other people who enter the United States through the immigration process from other countries can enter on temporary visas, or they can be admitted on a process that will allow them to become U.S. citizens. Palauans don't have to go through those processes. There are quotas that apply to the whole world for visas to enter the United States from countries. You're right next to the Philippines. It's a big concern for the Philippines, the quotas, limiting the number of Filipinos who can enter the United States. All Palauans can enter the United States freely, but on a non-immigrant basis. They're not there to become citizens of the United States.
Okay, Jeff, can you touch a little bit? Go ahead, President. All right.
While in Guam last, I think March or May, to attend the Micronesian Chief Executives Conference, one of the issues raised was the compact impact by Micronesians or Palauans or Marshallese into the United States. So we had a telephone conversation with Hawaii and CNMI and Guam. Of course, Guam and CNMI were there. And a U.S. representative from the DOI named Tom Bushnitz said that the children of FAA citizens born in the United States will become U.S. citizens, and therefore they will not be counted into the calculation of the compact impact damages or expenses. Right. So eventually, the Palauans and the FSM citizens in the United States will basically be phased out, and their children will become citizens, because I think the United States realizes that unless you control that, states like Hawaii or U.S. territory of Guam and Saipan will use that to get more funds from the United States. And there was also an argument about the different formula used by Hawaii and Guam and CNMI to calculate the cost of the compact impact. Right. And while there, let me say that some Palauans are afraid of the U.S. military presence. In my view, the best defense for Palau from external threats from hostile nations is to have strong presence of the United States in the Pacific. And we have enjoyed peace since the end of the war because of strong presence of the United States in the Pacific. For that, we should be thankful.
One more very important question to you, Mr. Farrow. It was asked yesterday, but please, explain again. In regards to those citizens of Palau that do have a criminal records and has been denied entry to United States, or they're in the United States and come home, and then this new system, they found out that these people have previous criminal records, What did the United States government told us yesterday? Can you explain a little bit more?
Well, the United States has always limited the right of people who have criminal records to enter the United States for the security of the United States, the security of people. And since the attack on the World Trade Center on 9/11, September 11, 2001, the United States has begun to enforce that law more. However, the U.S. Ambassador Helen Reed Rowe to Palau has said that she has worked on several cases in which even though someone from Palau may have a criminal record, the situation of that individual can be explained, and they can go through a procedure to make sure that that person would not present a threat to the U.S. community where they're going. So it is still possible for people to enter. There's no new requirement. This is a requirement that has been in law for a long time, that there is more enforcement of it now.
Okay, there's a question online right now. Hello, you still online? Ali? Ali, hindi nga line?
Oi, hindi ako salungin rong saw.
Kapong.
Malungil 2000 may kami, akali ka kasi, a National Weather Service sa address at sila compact. Since our other loader, a National Weather Service ang nila test, the Pacific Region Headquarters se PAS, mang sabihin loader, ang Ngidil Weather Bureau at sila Miguel. Akali ka kasi, sabihin tilkal micronations, el motor ay weather station ng Miguel. Sige kita karigi, kumal masulang.
President.
Saying that the United States Weather Bureau maintains a station in Micronesia and Palau and the Marshall Islands, and that the employees of Weather Bureau from Palau have passed examinations, qualified to work for the U.S. Weather Bureau. The question is, may they work for the U.S. bureaus in the United States?
I would assume so, but I don't know the answer, and I would have to look into it. They do have the right to enter the United States, and if they are qualified, it would seem to me that they should be able to. But you're telling me that they're
U.S.
not.
citizenship requirements.
U.S. citizenship is a
That's right.
requirement. Okay.
Senator, I know a guy by name Bode Sangal, Brigang Angal. He was weather and he moved to Hawaii.
Yeah.
He was a Weather Bureau employee here. And he moved to Hawaii, but I don't know whether he became a U.S. citizen or not.
After 9/11, a lot of things, even us in the military, were required to be U.S. citizen in order to get the higher grade, higher
Oh,
ranks.
really, eh?
Yeah. So I'm assuming that going to United States and work in the United States, your security clearance has to be cleared, and also you must be a U.S. citizen.
Makes sense.
Working at the post office, the same thing. Okay, before, Ponce went to Hawaii, it was okay during the trust territory time. But now, since after 9/11, yes, you're qualified, you pass the test, but still you have to be a citizen.
Since we have amended our Constitution to allow for multiple citizenship, you can always be a citizen by applying to be one, joining the U.S. Armed Forces or...
Right. So
etc.
my advice to this person here is go to United States, become a U.S. citizen, naturalized U.S. citizen, and then you can work just like any American. Okay. Mr. President, you gave me 1 hour and 30 minutes. It's your call if you want to continue on.
Keep it going. I mean, Jeff is
It's
here
okay with
for
me.
a day, but...
It's okay with me. There's a line. Our line is open right now. Our telephone number is 488-4848. And here's the next call. Aliungit Tutaw. Aliungit Tutaw.
Oi, mutas dias maldado ko gumiro ko. Mr. Ferro, good morning. Nice to finally put a face to the name. Hari ka President kasi earlier mention asing Amerika lang siya 2.5 million every year. Kita to the revenue 2.5 every year. That's 5 million every year local manage government. The appropriate nga every year nga 50 million lang. Same ko explain or more other
based upon wrong assumptions.
Wrong assumption.
What's the question?
It says we offered 2.5 million, the US offered 2.5 million, and we run the government. I think what he meant to say was about the repair and maintenance. Would you explain that? The matching fund for the maintenance of the compact road and the hospital, US-funded projects.
Right. Well,
Explain the process that we arrived at.
Right. As the compact review, the negotiation of this was that the U.S., when we finally agreed to the $250 million figure, that part of that from the U.S. was to be $2 million a year, up to $2 million a year from the U.S. government. matched by the government of Palau for infrastructure maintenance.
Right.
The budget, the compact road, and the airport. And there were two concerns that the government of Palau and President Toribiong's administration had with that. One was that it didn't have an additional $2 million a year to spend on maintenance. It's already spending money. And number two, the U.S. proposal was too limited in the types of infrastructure that could be funded with this infrastructure maintenance fund. So we negotiated, Ambassador Kashiba was very involved in this, negotiated so that Palau would only have to contribute $600,000 a year to the fund instead of $2 million a year. And in addition, Palau would be able to use the money with agreement of the U.S. on other infrastructure that, in addition to the airport and the compact road.
So the matching fund is how much to the U.S. contribution?
The U.S. contribution is $2 million, and the Palauan contribution would be $600,000 a year.
Okay, so we cut it down from dollar for dollar to $600,000 to $2 million.
Yep, saving the government of Palau $1.4 million a year.
Also, I'd like to add that the Compact Review Agreement signed in Hawaii allocated $10 million to pay for the previous payables as of 2009 when we took office, and the amount of the payables was about $14 million. And that's a big help to Palau. We can use that to pay off our outstanding debts, and that's a very big help for Palau.
Right, $10 million to pay off debts that had been incurred up to 2009 when President Toribiong took office. The Palau government had a deficit. Many people, businesses and individuals were not being paid for their services or goods that had been supplied to the government of Palau. So part of the negotiation on the part of the president was to get money from the U.S. government to help pay those old debts off.
And some of those old debts had to be paid when we took office because they were demanding payments. So we reached an agreement with the United States that as long as we keep receipts of those old debts paid after 2009, they can be reimbursed when the Compact Review Agreement is approved.
Correct.
Yeah. Here's the question just came in, but it doesn't make sense to me. I'm going to read it. President, if you can help me on this. Explain again. Tial security amle start tercera 9/11 around New York, not JT administration amle start ringi tial Homeland Security going to US. Understand.
I think what they want to say is that the requirement or the condition that an immigrant or an immigrant to Palauan traveling to the United States have to have a clean record, criminal record. It did not begin after 2011. It was already in the books, but it was not applied.
Or enforced.
To Palauans. But when the United States became so concerned about terrorism, act of terrorism, then they simply enforced what was in the law books.
I see.
And that's with respect to, it's not just for Palauans, it's just being
world.
applied to the whole world, anybody
world.
entering the U.S.
Yeah.
If you come from, say, the Philippines and you apply for a visa, you have to show your criminal record.
That's right.
And if you have criminal record, you can't go to the United States.
You don't get the visa.
To get a visa. So it was applicable to Palau, but they didn't bother to apply it. But they were alerted by the threats of terrorism after 2011.
Let me.
But there's a process to waive that and obtain a visa. We have helped some Palauans go back to the United States by going through the process. Go to the embassy, get a form, fill it out. A filing fee is $500. And the embassy will send that to the Homeland Security with some recommendations by responsible citizens or leaders of Palau, and you get a clearance. But if it's a fresh criminal record, it's difficult to overcome that, especially crimes involving violence and crimes involving fraud and deception or involve moral turpitude.
Okay. I want to explain that in Palawan. Lolgo niya presidente say ang aria process El sugum gawa das was sengarngia ka gidele recorder gawa ser 1819. Please sebum pora American Embassy filo seguir the application.
Ministeriano first.
Oo. Ministeriano.
Embassy.
Oo. So lang tiramos monge harar seguir el fee at the clear guns and mora United States. Ay gan la lol ay ga gidel betok la larngi endi abulur Amerika rangaramong aswel timral in and out timlak salmal timlak enforce and this say gidel 9/11 tiram lo start to really enforce and they became so serious about the security of the United States. So these are not new. Diagal BS. Timlang arngi hindi seral boringa 9/11 telilut mal mokorkikla gidam lo affect gida adraga gidel FAS state. Okay, now here's another question came in through. These people are afraid to call in because this is a campaign year and they don't want their voices to be heard on the radio and television. You see, this thing is keep on ringing. They're afraid to ask question. Yeah. Okay, can you explain more about that $50,000 that U.S. citizen owes tax, and then they pay it, and you're going to use that money for the $250 million. Can you elaborate more on that? Because he didn't quite understand.
Sure.
Yeah.
What the idea is that if you owe taxes to the U.S. government in excess of $50,000, and this is not these are U.S. citizens, not Palauans, by the way. I want to make sure people don't misunderstand that. But they're U.S. citizens. If you owe more than $50,000 in taxes to the U.S. government, and there's no dispute that you owe the taxes. If you're suing, sometimes people have a dispute with the Internal Revenue Service, with the tax collectors, and they go to court. But if this is all clear that you owe the money, you've exhausted your legal remedies, and you still are refusing to pay the government. The idea is that the Secretary of State would not issue a passport to any such person or could revoke the passport of that person. And that by having a law like that, that will encourage people who owe money, owe substantial monies in taxes. It will encourage them to pay their taxes so they can get a U.S. passport to travel or whatever. It certainly, to me, makes no sense that if somebody owes a lot of money to the U.S. government and then they want to get a passport to get out of the United States so they can't have the money collected. So I think there's a pretty broad acceptance of this idea. The question is whether it can be used to pay for the compact assistance to Palau, or whether it should be used to pay for the tax cuts that Republicans want to maintain in the U.S.
Let me just give you some questions to clarify. This is going to be a new source because previously nobody had to pay that money to get his passport.
Right. There was no relationship between getting your passport and whether you owed taxes or not.
And number two, what's the estimated amount of revenues that can be derived from this process?
It's estimated that this would raise $743 million over 10 years.
Okay, here's a question from Iran.
So let me explain that in Palau.
Okay, go ahead.
CLBS source raw do identify niya Jeff mora Congress sa tirkel atram rigel belsir ra tax engalak o gibel telael edekal haraw amrigel mo revoke a passport tir mal uben dekal prestem es passport ese tarak at gelbel trirak en gorgriak med le widel dart magrengel million el close do iringi regal next 15 years le rule dart mo gibel million.
Hindi tiagi the president, hindi diakalongi il mol.
They're not going to wait. Just a source identified, and then they pay their obligation. It's a mandatory payment to Palau. So it will not. We don't have to wait for the revenues to be derived before they give the money.
Okay.
Diakalongi raw do. They do a source.
Okay.
Tiramski daw do.
Tiramski daw do. Did a question, naray me. That mulwa say, let me speak in English. The question is that. Why the United States Congress the congressmen themselves, senators, don't come here and face us instead of sending staff to Palau.
Hey, we're a very small island. These guys are busy.
Explain.
Explain that.
Well, the real reason Ambassador Koshiba is saying he's, was elected to the OEK and Congress of Micronesia a lot, so he knows this. This is campaign time in the United States. This is a very hotly contested election. The Republicans hope to take the White House back from the Democrats. The Republicans hope to take a majority in the Senate from the Democrats. I don't think they're going to succeed, but it is going to be a close or is expected to be a close election. Democrats lost their majority in the House of Representatives in 2010, and they're trying to reclaim that, or at least make up some of the difference between Republicans and Democrats. It's an especially difficult election because in the United States we have a census every 10 years. We count the number of people in each state. After the census, the seats in the House of Representatives are reapportioned among the states, and then within each state, the district lines are changed every 10 years. So this is the first election after that apportionment in 2010. So a lot of Congress people are facing districts that are somewhat new to what they ran in 2010. So they are busy campaigning right now.
Okay.
Let me just say that in 2009, we received a U.S. delegation consisting of the congressmen from American Samoa,
I see.
from Guam, from the Virgin Islands, from North Carolina, Mr. Brown, and from
West Virginia,
Nick Rahal. And this year, we got 4 senior staffs from the U.S. Congress, House and Senate. Let me say that from my experience, the staff in the U.S. Congress don't change. Al Stayman has been there since day one.
I see.
Brian Modest has been there.
I see.
So to me, this briefing was more technical and detailed
I see.
than if the congressmen came, because the congressmen are concerned about so many issues about their own constituents in their own states. So I think the briefing was perhaps more technical and more in-depth.
I see.
Because unlike Palau, the staff of U.S. Congress remained in office in spite of the change in the composition of the Congress, whether Republicans or Democrats. Is that true, Jeff?
That's very true, and you mentioned Al Stayman. Al Stayman and I worked on the compact legislation, the original compact in the late 1980s when the legislation was approved. Brian Modest was on the staff of the Subcommittee on Insular Affairs of the House when I was the staff director, and I left being staff director in 1994, and Brian was a member of the staff back then. He then became the staff director later on. He became the staff director after Tony Babauta, who's now the Assistant Secretary of Interior for Insular Affairs. But I think in letters that you mentioned, a letter from Congresswoman Ileana Ross-Layton, and in letters that you've received from, the President's received from so many members of Congress, it's very clear how the members of Congress feel about this as well. When Chairman Manzullo introduced his bill in the House with Eni Faleomavaenga, there were 14 other congressmen who co-sponsored the legislation. There are a number of senators who have co-sponsored the legislation in the Senate. Many more have spoken in favor of it in the hearings and so forth. So I think, as the President said, we wanted to get just as I've done this morning, a very detailed explanation, because people in the Congress and the executive branch want to make sure the people of Palau understand that we have some politics in the U.S. I think maybe there's some politics in Palau.
There is.
But is there politics in Palau?
Very much so.
More intense, perhaps.
Yes.
Let me go ahead and
But there
summarize.
is politics in the United States, and that's what really this is about.
There's a text just came and said, please speak in Palau, and I'm meaning you, President. So I'm going to summarize that. They say, well, Jeff, I'm not going to say, hindi wa kita atrapelaw. nga maktirek madak termodibus le tukuk mo change raking lek tirga every 10 years and are you see the recount the reapportionment we call it kida every 8 years president what say every 8 years oh tiar lang tirga direct to send a staff tirga a civil servant they don't change them ya bela was just the opposite nga katsugo maklusa senkyo my staff coped with me okay so it's very different between United States and Palau nga mal ngariak le roser ngi el ante mela campaign mata mga dura constituents tir e sola direct visit gel areas tira mamalasen kyorngi mangmalo uidele ma ulung diakat sab ilme by sendra staff mang selemet ng may gigil technical questions ma tokol ngramang ral dulsa de malmong smother mortir e tira say nay or no okay
Klutus modil
Tabe
vor
president
was sera tu onaina imle congressional delegation mle congressman West Virginia Nick Rahol mle chairman ra committee on natural resources
handling the compact
mle Madeline Bordalio ra Guam mle Christensen ra Virgin Islands mle Mr. Brown ra North Carolina Mastaffertir mangel na American Samal fale mavaenga selgum tabra kakaroso tir betegal staff tirgem isang abtokul tugoy mambayde al salt mall aklaw ngirtir ragil detail luryor tirgal staff ran men na house ma senate tirgal change for about 20 30 years some of them have been working for those committees to pasel cloud ngir gira le galuryor tirgel mangil tir congress deru rag e change abay dia akmat mall cloud ngirtir mong bike mamle will sell briefing tiraги tirgel brut aurior tirgel brut artial bavier ma gel mondalo lus bavier man leungin sel briefing e marklo a sekram rigel wa belau dekas il to braking lir le tmol alboret tmla ma magera senkyo to bang saule senator
okay I think we have said it all those important questions from the public already came in and again we just kind of repeating the same thing we were talking about yesterday. But today we were trying to give you an opportunity for grassroots or general public to call in and ask questions. So here's a call just came in. We're going to take that and make that a last call. And we're going to have to say goodbye to you and also everybody. Okay? So here's the next call, President. Ali, yung itutaw? Ali, mga dalo.
Hey, ututaw.
May ask a question or go?
Hello. Oh, ututaw.
May ask a question or go? Alam mo giro nga mga dalo.
Chamber talk mo. Alpo yung mga presidente mo da mga galudod.
Okay. I know that question. He only said the first word, and I know exactly what he's talking about. That caller talking about a paid advertisement that came out of Palau newspaper, simply saying that the United States is holding back these $250 million because they're waiting for who is going to be the next president of Palau. And if whoever that person is become a president of Palau in the United States does not like that person, they'll disapprove that money. That's the question. Go ahead, Jeff.
Well, I mean, that's just.
Let me push this back by saying,
Okay.
during my administration with Ambassador Koshiba and Jeff Ferrer, we have worked this far that the only remaining condition is the approval of the US Congress. So the consequence of Palau's election or the results do not change the process. That's my feeling. But we have brought the process to the point where the only remaining condition is the approval of this Congress. So now I'll give it to Jeff.
Okay, good.
I think what you said, Mr. President, is correct. And the U.S. commitment to Palau, I don't think is going to change. I think, to be honest, and not because you're sitting next to me, but to be honest, there's a great deal of appreciation in Washington, in members of Congress and people like Secretary Clinton and others in the executive branch of the U.S. government for the way that the government of Palau, since you've been president, has been working with the government of the United States. And that's in part shown by the success that we've had in negotiating so much of an increase in funding for Palau over these past few years. You can never say what would happen if something were different. You can never say for sure. But it's very clear that officials of the U.S. government believe that Palau has very responsible leadership right now. Doesn't mean that somebody else might not be a responsible leader. Doesn't mean that the U.S. would not have the same interests, but certainly we have had a lot of success in increasing the amount of money under this compact review agreement. I would also say this, and it was said by the congressional staff yesterday, it would be a mistake to try to renegotiate this compact review agreement because the budgetary situation in the United States has gotten so tight. And as of January 2nd, 2013, after this election, there are going to be major cuts in the federal budget. Right now, there's a law already enacted that will cut all federal programs with a few exceptions. Palau's compact funding, we've gotten to be an exception, by the way. But most federal programs, including some of the programs that benefit Palau, will be cut by 8%, 1/12 of the program. And of course, there are members of Congress and governors and so forth who don't like who don't like these cuts. So they're going to be fighting a lot about that next year, about how to deal with the budget cuts that are automatically going to take effect. And Palau has leadership right now that's respected in Washington, is known in Washington. Palauans ought to have an election coming up. People ought to vote for whomever they think is best to lead Palau. But you have right now a good situation in Washington. So I hope I'm saying that in a sensitive way.
Let me make an observation. Had Ambassador Koshiba and my administration failed to successfully negotiate the compact review agreement in Hawaii, do you think more people would run for the president's office? Let's raise the question. Take it from there.
Let me ask this one question. I know the answer, but can you answer this? This is Senator asking Jeff about the first compact. We had $500 million plus, and we failed to develop our country, meaning infrastructures. Now, the $250 million, she's worried about for the next 15 years, maybe this money supposedly going to do the infrastructures and whatever, but she's worried that it may happen again, just like the first $500 million.
Before he responds, let me respond.
I know you get those 5 people. Please explain to the public.
In Honolulu, during the compact review negotiations, I wanted to include within the compact for Palau 2 things. Number one, that the direct financial assistance should be allocated for public safety, for education and health. Second one was to include a team of experts on the economy, 2 to be appointed by Palau, 2 by the United States, and 1 to be jointly appointed.
I see.
And these were to be experts, because I don't think it will take the compact money to make Palau economically self-sufficient. I think it takes smart economic advisors to steer the way for Palau to move into the future. How to change our law to make Palau more investment friendly. How to attract investments for Palau. Because it doesn't take those grants to make Palau self-sufficient. Those grants will be used to lay the foundation, like infrastructure, health, education. But it takes good economic development policy, a great investment law, to bring in investment, to develop the economy, to become more private sector based than government based. And I think if you bring those experts to Palau and you work hard, trying to work smart, and come to 24 and you failed, you can then have a good reason to us, the United States, to continue to assist us move in that direction. Instead of giving us more grants, try to entice investors to bring new capital to Palau. Because if you look at our economy, it's actually based upon grants and foreign assistance.
Let me see.
The only real revenues to Palau are from tourism and fishing. The rest, which circulates in the country, which make a lot of retailers rich, actually I recycled grant money coming to the economy. So we need to bring in investment, new capital to the private sector. So the purpose for that team of experts is to basically help Palau steer its course into the future in the right direction, to de-emphasize grants and to emphasize investment.
Summarizing it toward Belau, Letida.
Aktirul was a Seragibor Honolulu, a Metablor Tokoil, Black Krigikla. I among sel shock sets road Merbelau, abodo miringi lomsin del mora school, ma hospital, mablila bulis, toerala. Ongerong melas merulia tim tergel semong ratogora geizai. Terung am tut kram rigel, terung Belau, ongei mertiram tut kram mabel tablol bulu. Teman ngaseur Belau el mengekmok laungil la, maungil policy, el ngaseur gidel msiuli Belau, mengmeral bedula. Atogora geizai lol tuap estudo der Belau, ma investment, maguruli Belau mengosip ela geizai rengil lom alu rakabal mentergid. Dia sal mal diul tuila grant. Kudos pera ungil luldaso, maungil direction, maungil policy. Le sugo momreka 2024 gida mleul tuira advice te gida madulat. El mertut kram regel Belau, dia sark mal mongusel mokteker kid. En sem elam regel motor mosukit, le gida murten dula a direction, ramlisi rageizai, dia sal diul tuira kabalment.
Okay, we're coming to an end of this show, you know. It's been going on for 2.5 hours. I remember when we were in Honolulu and our ambassador made a statement to U.S. Team saying that, look, you guys gave us $500 million, but you didn't assist us, so we just spent it, you know. And now you're giving us $250 million, so please give us a team of experts, economists. Every year we meet, you set the directions, and that's the only way we can develop our country. I remember him saying that.
Let me say that the arrangements for Palau about that team of experts is different from what they call GEMCO for FSM, the Marshall Islands, which handle the compact funds. They're not. They're giving us advice on how to use the compact money and how to steer Palau toward economic self-sufficiency.
Okay. Mr. President, we're coming to an end. Jeff, so we're going to start from, I want to give the line to Ambassador so he can say a few words, and then Jeff, and then you close the program. But Ambassador, thank you for doing a good job. Thank you. And do you have enough funding for CRC? Or are you short? Or?
You are aware when I requested my budget to you guys, the president asked us to cut our budget in half, which I did.
Yeah.
And I'm getting short because I have a friend of mine who's been helping us a lot. And please give us extra.
And who paid for his trip to and from? You?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So there's a budget too, supplemental budget too,
Thank
and I
you,
think
Senator.
your money is in there, so we're going to work.
Your Ways and Means Committee asked me to...
Mark.
Yeah, to justify. So this is a justification I'm sitting with me right now.
Okay.
In the compact.
All right.
Thank you.
All right. Jeff?
Well, again, Senator, thank you for giving this opportunity to talk to the people of Palau directly about what we've been doing and what the issues are, what questions people have. But people should understand that the compact negotiations were very successful, increased the amount of money tremendously that Palau will be receiving. The money is being earmarked for important priorities like health and education and public safety. There'll be, as the President was just explaining, an economic advisory group that will help ensure money is wisely spent, but it will be a Palauan decision of how to spend the money. There's money, a lot of money goes towards infrastructure, money going to pay for debts, and additional major contribution to the trust fund so that it will be able to produce the amount of money that it was intended to in the future. And there is almost universal agreement in the Congress on what has been agreed to. And we have the technical fights and the political fights between Democrats and Republicans that are affecting many programs that are holding up the final approval of the legislation. But everybody says that it will be approved.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Mr. President.
May kote alle gure nga sa dalaw rogu igre la aurel nam kot mok de alsil sil dia til ma ul ngami wa ul mon part mer modul sa amrige la kargi krebelau agot mu drupli Kurt Campbell May mangel Admiral Haney elnya commander of Pacific Fleet au eri seng le Secretary of Interior Assistant Secretary of Interior Tony Babauta el angin le US Congressional Delegation direct last week in Blengel Admiral Guamal Admiral Payne. Bago Mr. Miguel ang masar mo dringi legregel blue ang ya masang rablu ate malkat gi krebelau bakmot ta aleus orang asule la blue Miguel direct mo ta orang asule la Jeff Farrow la Miguel May Ibasabel la bantil staff ra US Congress mo dora ada olbira rulau marka venors mo amare eli rogui eli lut television mosmodi drule la kampak tram ta US Congress Ulit tangis so olbia rulau bos bel kergi tim satial compact review team rigi fundingi le kada mark pedra ul bangalel la kada kedra ul bangalel bol beotarmut akmate allo ni takil tangat le marablu belau ada belau roku itu kuni yang lagi belau ngaragel bring daul di keringi rablu lat yo ni takil tangat le marabu ada belau ar maktoban bi grei mar beklar yo lingi tarubak lios ngam tangat le belau rak lugu mangyaos el mor mata ko man saul